As we continue looking at the interurban cars of rapid railway, we see that so many of the folks in the early 1900s used this mode of transportation to get from here to Detroit or to visit relatives along the river, St. Clair, Marine City, Algonac, going along the waterfront in Lake St. Clair to Mount Clemens, take the waterfront route all the way into Detroit and later on into Toledo. And it was a relatively inexpensive way to travel to these places. It doesn't seem far by today's standard, but these were cities that were quite a distance because they didn't have the mode of transportation we have today. So let's see what the folks from Port Huron back in the early 1900s would have seen as they boarded these interurban cars. Well, the first thing they would have seen would be, of course, the conductor, or the motorman in this case, where he'd be steering. And you can see the steps going up. You see the pole there to hang on where people are getting on and off. And then just to the left, you'll see a wood-burning stove to be able to give the customers warmth during the cold weather. This picture here gives a little better view of the stove. You can see it there with the pipe extending to the roof. And then, of course, in the front, you had the seating where the motorman sat, and you also see the fare box that the folks would put their money into as they came on board. Very few controls on an urban car or a street car. Basically, you had no steering. You just had to control the throttle, and then you had a brake, and then you had the emergency brake, and then you had a valve that released sand for traction. But we'll talk more about that later. As you head back into the car, you would find several different seating type arrangements. This is a very bare necessity type of seating. I call it the plain Jane. It's basically just a bench seating all the way down both sides of the car. And this would have been used for shorter runs because it would have been the most comfortable seating, but you could get a lot of people on it. Now look at the top of the cars. I always found the top of the cars very interesting, the way they looked. And here, if you look closely, you can see the electrical lighting that they had on the cars. This type of seating was more indicative of the type of seating they had in these cars, much more comfortable. And if you look at this ceiling, you'll see that the bare wood support isn't visible. It's all covered up. Looks quite nice, actually, and has a little fancier lighting system as well. In this seating arrangement, I call these the bucket seats. They're individual seats for the folks that boarded the interurban. And this ceiling is a little different than the first two that we've seen. It looks a little bit more modern than the first two that we looked at, including the electric lights in it. Now, we've seen this configuration of seating before, but what I wanted you to pay attention to is the roof on this car, especially the lighting. Look at the lighting here. The lighting all seems to be side lighting coming out from the grating on the top. And then, of course, below that, you can see all their advertisements that go along right below that, advertising the local merchants. The other thing to pay attention to is in the very front of the car. At least I assume it's the front of the car. You see the window above that, you see more lighting, and it looks like there's windows above the regular windows, or else that's like a skylight. Kind of interesting. And then you come down here and you see the conductor and the motorman just taking a little break, I guess. The seating arrangement that gave the company the most for their money was this seating arrangement right here. I think it's pretty obvious why. There's no aisle in this car. And the way the folks entered the car was through the doors on the left, and each door went to each seat. And they would be able to take up the whole capacity of the car with the passengers. I would imagine these were used as short runs to specific places, like maybe to Belle Isle or to an amusement park or some place where it wasn't a long run, because I can see a little bit of a problem there. If someone had to use the facilities, it's pretty difficult to get off a moving train or climbing over all the other passengers. This seating arrangement was very versatile, however, because this seating arrangement could be changed. The seats you see on the right could all be swung back to go all along the wall, creating one big long bench seat against the right side. You'd have the smaller seats on the left side, and you'd have an aisle in between. And so they could use that configuration when it suited their purposes. These next two cars that you see had the least amount of seating possible. These were wicker chairs, and these were used for special events, charters, and for VIPs. And this the same way with this next picture we're looking at here. This was taken a little bit later in the century, probably in the 20s. But you can see very comfortable arrangements. There's also private cars that were used as well, usually by the owner of the company or by VIPs within the company or their guests that they would let them use. And you can see this is a pretty comfortable car. Nothing better than laying in your chaise lounge as the scenery goes by. The problem with photos that go back in history is that they're all black and white, and you really can't get an idea of some of the elegance that was in these cars. But I found this in a restored car that'll give you some idea of what these cars look like. Pretty nice. And this photograph gives you a good view of what the motorman was using when he was driving this thing. For folks to be able to go to the big city of Detroit was amazing back in the early 1900s. There weren't that many cars around back then, and the interurban gave them a way to go to the big city. It was an adventure. I mean, even as a boy, it was an adventure for me, and we had a car. But you know what's more of an adventure? To go from Port Huron to the Atlantic Ocean. Now that's an adventure, and that's exactly what this man here did. His name is R.H. Durrah. He's from Boston. But he started his trip in Port Huron, Michigan. And he made a journal of it that I found in this magazine, the Railway Review. His trip would take him eastward about 1,500 miles through various interurban streetcar lines. And he wanted to make the most of each stop, and so he would stop along the way and see things. And he was especially appreciative of the scenery of Port Huron and the things that Port Huron had to offer. And this is what he says, and I'll slow down my narration a little bit to kind of match up with some of the pictures that he may have seen, and you can kind of get an idea what he was talking about. He says this: to begin my journey, I started at Port Huron, located 73 miles north of the city of Detroit on the St. Clair River. I set out with a determination not to miss anything of interest. Therefore, a trip around the world was in order. Taking an electric car, I was soon transferred to a car of the Grand Trunk Railroad. And in a few minutes disappeared in a great hole in the ground, the largest submarine tunnel in the world under the St. Clair River. After a distance of some 3 miles, I was landed in Sarnia on the Canadian side of the river. A short ride in a horse car to the ferry, then back to Port Huron by boat. And I had visited 2 countries, been under the water, over the water, employing electric, railway, locomotive, horse, and marine engine power, all for the sum of 25 cents. Port Huron is a beautiful city and is noted for its deep spring bath. Here I boarded one of the handsome palace cars of the Detroit Rapid Railway system for a ride along a high elevation affording a grand view of the river and its pleasure boats and steamers which ply on the delightful St. Clair. Still following the river, you are taken through the charming little summer resorts of Marysville, St. Clair, Marine City, and Algonac, with their camps with their load of iron, copper, and grain, which in itself is a sight well worth going miles to see. In order to see Detroit and see it properly, one should not miss a trip in the handsome excursion car, Yolandi. Which makes regular trips through the principal business and residential sections of the city, accompanied by a competent guide. Another year, a similar car will be placed in service on the Cleveland lines. The cost of this trip is 25 cents, and the time consumed is 2 hours. I thought this part of the story might interest you. He goes on from Detroit and continues in the story about everything he sees along the way to the Atlantic Ocean, and it's an interesting story. Quite unusual for that time period for a person to take that kind of a trip on an interurban especially. I also found this article in one of the street railway periodicals. It says this, and this is referring to the different car barns they had along the route from Detroit to Port Huron. There are 5 car houses along the line, located as follows. 1 brick barn at Roseville, capacity about 10 large 55-foot cars. Our brick barn in Mount Clemens, capacity 4 large cars. 1 iron shed near Mount Clemens, capacity 12 to 16 large cars. 1 frame barn at Marine City, capacity 6 large cars. And 1 large brick and iron barn in Port Huron, capacity about 30 large cars. When I read this, I scratched my head regarding the Port Huron barn. And the reason for being is that this car barn that we're familiar with, at least some of us are familiar with, the only one I knew of, would only hold about 10 cars at the most. So was it possible that Port Huron had 2 car barns? It would make sense, 1 car barn for the streetcars of Port Huron, the city streetcars, and 1 streetcar, since Port Huron was an endpoint, for the interurban cars. And so I did some more research and went back through more periodicals, and come to find out I come across this picture right here. I come across a building I didn't even know existed, the Port Huron Interurban Car Barn. You can see that this car barn is huge and would well contain 30 cars. And it looks quite like an interesting structure here architecturally. It looks like you've got castle watchtowers on each corner on the front. The rest of it is pretty much standard fare. And it's quite open in the front. It has 3 car tracks there on the left, doors for the cars go into, and then the rest look like double or even triple doors, quite easily to get in and out of. And perhaps there are not even doors, perhaps there were no doors on them, but I would think that there would be, especially in the wintertime. I have yet to determine where this was located at, but I'm still working on that. We learn something new every day. I also came across these 2 pictures of workers inside the car barn doing the maintenance and whatever had to be done to the interurban cars. I told you in our last video that we would take a ride from Detroit to Port Huron and going through many of the stops you see here on this ticket. But lack of time, this video is almost done and we won't be able to get to it today. But we'll get to it in our next video. But one thing we will look at in our next video is that we're going to stop off at one of these stops. And we're going to stop off at one of the largest resorts in America. And we're going to see the major competition that Port Huron had in the resort industry. So I hope you'll join me.